Well, good evening, Little Masters, and welcome to episode 24 of the Rings of Power Wrap-Up.
It's time to pull up a bench here in the common room, folks. I'm Sara Brown, Shield Maiden of Rohan.
And I'm James Tauber, the Sage of the South. And we're both here with the Man of the West, Alan Sisto.
And tonight we're going to be chatting with someone whose name you might not know, but whose amazing work you are certain to be familiar.
We are really excited to have him join us, folks. We know you're looking forward to hearing from him. But before we start, a quick welcome for those of you joining us for the first time. Here at the Rings of Power Wrap-Up, we talk about the plot, characters, and lore behind Amazon's The Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power.
We also dive into some of Tolkien's biggest themes, like mortality, free will, fellowship, and, maybe production design. We also do our fair share of speculating, but not this time.
You'll learn something new about Middle-earth every time you listen, and we hope you have a few laughs in the process. We're glad you joined us.
And we hope you'll be glad you joined us as well. Before we get into this week's episode, we want to remind you to check out Alan's original show, The Prancing Pony Podcast.
For nearly 7 years now, the Prancing Pony Podcast has walked its way through Tolkien's books, from the Silmarillion to the Lord of the Rings, and this season the podcast is continuing that effort with The Return of the King.
Now, this season I am co-hosting episodes with a real all-star lineup of folks from the Tolkien community. And humbly, I would like to think that there is no better companion for your extended trip through Middle-earth than the Prancing Pony Podcast.
But let's get straight to this. He was the production designer for visually stunning films 10 Cloverfield Lane and Hotel Artemis, among many others.
And he was an art director for Minority Report and AI, as well as the supervising art director on Star Trek Into Darkness, Tomorrowland, and more.
And if you've ever been to Disney's California Adventure, and I have with my son, and he loves this place, you've almost certainly seen his work. He designed the Avengers Campus, and my personal favorite, the award-winning Animation Pavilion. Just an awesome place. Right now, though, he's the production designer for Amazon's The Rings of Power. Ramsey Avery, welcome to the Rings of Power Wrap-Up.
Well, thank you very much. That was quite a wow introduction.
Well, we try to do our homework here.
I was going to say the wow's entirely on our side.
Yeah,
absolutely.
The Animation Pavilion is still one of my highlights at either park. So
it is actually one of the favorite projects I've ever worked on. I really like that space. I love watching people walk into this space and the way their eyes light up. It's a really nice experience.
It is fantastic. Yeah. But that's not one of our questions today, is it, James? And you get to lead off. So I'm going to hand it off to James here.
Yeah. So before we get into Rings of Power, I understand that you were once an astrophysics major in college.
Yep.
What led to that transition from that to art direction and production design?
Well, I've been doing theater pretty much since I was a kid in some form or another, and still carried that through high school and carried that into college. Nobody makes a living at theater or the arts, right? So there was no way that was really going to be my career. And I definitely loved science, and I definitely loved the way I've always been interested in how things get started. Like, what's the basis of a thing and what makes it happen? And so I was very drawn into the idea of astrophysics and cosmology in the sense that how the universe began.
Yeah.
So that's really what I was kind of heading myself into. And at the same time, I was doing theater at night at college. And I just one morning went, I love being in the theater, and I can't imagine myself sitting on a mountaintop in the cold looking at a telescope the rest of my life. And I'd much rather be with people. And you know what? In terms of getting things started, you make worlds. You actually get to make a world when you're doing this. Now, at the time, it was all about acting and directing, and I'm a horrible actor. So that was certainly not the plan, and that was never going to be the end result. And I switched majors, and when I graduated, I ended up with a choice to go do a directing program on the East Coast or go do a design program on the West Coast. And being from the Rocky Mountains, the East Coast sounded a little scary to me, so I went to California.
I hear you on that.
On the design thing. So that's how I got here.
Wonderful.
As a native Californian, I agree with you.
Excellent.
And as someone from Wales, you can barely tell the difference between any of the states. I'm sure that was the right decision.
Well, it certainly worked out in the long run. That's
it certainly seems to have done, that is for sure. Okay, so let's focus in a little bit more on your work on the Rings of Power then. Can you tell us, what is it like working with John Howe? Tell us a bit about the process from his concept art to your final designs and the execution of those designs.
Well, I have to say that when I was offered the job, probably one of the third or fourth things I thought about is, oh my God, I'm going to work with John Howe, and how terrifying that was at that moment to make that realization. And it turns out, of course, he's the most lovely man in the entire world. So that's like no ego, and he's just charming, and he's just a font of wisdom, not just about the Lord of the Rings and the history of Tolkien and all of that, but just about art, and architecture, and what his sense of what the world is and what's important to see in the world. All of that was, it's just this wonderful resource of information, but also a very good way to spend a part of my day, just talking with him, because there was almost always something that led to something in those conversations, So one thing that we had to really kind of work our way through is that we were in the second age, not the third age. And there was very definitely a kind of a stylization that John and Alan Lee had come up with that defined the third age. So trying to work back from those third age ideas with John, and then also taking John's ideas and working with other people, what I found worked in some cases, like the exterior of Forodwaith, that whole big castle thing. That was something that John and I talked through and did pretty much just he and I together, talking about how we wanted it to be the sense of chaos becoming organized. When you're Morgoth, you're more chaotic. When you're getting closer to Sauron, it's getting more organized.
Right.
And how that all worked out. So that exterior was like really clearly John bringing his full game to it. But the interior, there was a really rough, loose sketch that John had done that was kind of this very amorphous image that had a couple of spikes in it. And I was like, oh, that's what this should be, is about that spikiness, because you could see that that's scary and it makes it spooky, and making it irregular makes it chaotic. And Morgoth is chaotic and Sauron is organized. And so, but past that, so John, that was just like this little, where he gave us a little kick, and then I worked with other people to come up with the idea. There were things that would be very specific, like the whole ring device at the end, the castering, the device that divides the metals, was working very specifically with John and another artist who would take some of John's 2D ideas and then start to develop it in 3D. And it really kind of worked from case to case. But in the long run, because it was such a huge project and that we had so many different people doing so many different things, the best part for me of working with John was that we didn't come up with this phrase until afterwards, but basically what he did was provided a DNA of Tolkien. I could, while a lot of the specifics may not be the thing we were trying to get to at that moment, there was always something. I could always have him do some work and do some sketching and have something that would spring into something else, because there was an idea that where he lived was that specific idea of what made something feel like Middle-earth. So that's where he was a touchstone in that respect for the design process.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I love that. I love that idea of him being like the genesis of all of it, if you like, and then giving out those ideas for you to realize, if you like. That sounds absolutely amazing.
It really does. I also liked your observation about the difference between Morgoth and Sauron.
Same.
Yeah, because that's exactly what we've got there is Morgoth, the nihilist, who just wants to destroy everything.
Yeah.
And Sauron, who wants it all organized in neat little boxes that he rules them all. But,
well, and he certainly had the chance to say, well, that process didn't work, so maybe we should try something a little different.
That was a very good point.
Yeah, Sauron's more kind of the CEO, the board, isn't he? Trying to organize everything. Yeah, not quite getting there perhaps, but definitely less chaotic. But I love the idea that the way in which Forodwaith was pictured by both of you kind of externalizes that idea of Morgoth's chaos and Sauron's control, if you like. And I just think that's absolutely amazing.
It really is. Well, folks, we're going to come back with more questions for Ramsey right after the break.
We're about to get back to our chat with Ramsey Avery, but we want to remind you that when you finish listening, the talk continues all night long at the Rings of Power wrap-up, all through the off-season too.
We have an amazing community of listeners, and they really do keep the conversation going. From the Rings of Power group on Facebook, our Twitter feed, our Reddit community, and more.
Now on Facebook, just look for Rings Wrap-Up. Be sure to follow the page so that you get all of our posts and episodes, but also join the group for some great discussions on the show and on each of our shows.
If you're on Reddit, look us up at r/ringswrapup and follow us on Twitter and Instagram, where we're at ringswrapup.
And a quick favour to ask. If you like the show, please help us by giving us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts and recommend us to your friends.
All right, with that all done, let's go ahead and get back to the interview and chatting with Ramsey. James, you're up.
Yeah, so how do you manage a project like the Rings of Power with what must have been a massive art department?
One step at a time, really. I often think, and I've said several times, if you really realized in the morning how many millions of decisions you were going to have to make in the next week or 2 years, you just wouldn't get out of bed. It just would be overwhelming. And the process is making sure that, well, you have a process, that there's a plan to work through each thing. And part of that comes from the schedule. I mean, you just have to triage what's going to be the first thing you have to put in front of camera. So let's concentrate on that. What are the things that are going to take the longest to make? Even though they may not be the first thing, you have to start with them earlier because they're going to take longer to do. If you're going to build an entire city, you better start ahead of time to figure out what you're going to do that. But there really was kind of a combination of looking at these are the things we have to get done in the sequence we have to get done because of the episodes they're coming up in. Also, there was a process of being able to figure out what each environment was and then how that fed into what the next environment might be or might not want to be because you needed to make sure that it looked like something different. There's a creative process in all of that in terms of making those decisions, but there's certainly the logistical management part of it. And that's certainly not me. I come from a supervising art directing background, so I'm actually good at the organizational part of it. But we had a really good supervising art director, Jules Cook, that's kind of his job. But even for him, it was too big of a job to take on. And we brought in a second supervising art director when I first started to take care of that organizational process, to figure out the budgets and what are we doing first and what's the schedule and what goes where. And that allowed Jules to concentrate on how do we get these things built, the things that have to get done first. And then we have a group of art directors that work underneath of them, and each of them are assigned a particular environment, a particular series of sets, and then each of them have their set designers that are doing the drawings underneath of them. Meanwhile, what I'm doing in my own little world is that I've got 20, 30 concept artists working around the world. And so I'm trying to be ahead of those logistical things by starting to come up with the concepts in the right order and working with the showrunners and with the various directors to make sure that those concepts are hitting the mark in terms of concept and feel and tone and color, telling the emotional beat that we're trying to get out of each scene or each area, each sequence with those particular environments. And then as we start to hit that kind of conceptual basis, making sure talking to Jules and then him talking and myself talking with the other departments, the set decorators, the construction department, the sculptors, the greensmen, that all these things are achievable. And then almost always in lockstep on this project, talking to visual effects and particularly with Jason Smith in terms of how are we going to execute what we can't put in front of camera. So it's always kind of keeping 12 plates spinning in the air at all times and trying to make sure that I'm giving enough attention to that plate and then I can run over and give enough attention to that plate. But it's not just me, there's a lot of people, and we were so fortunate in this project that the people who were on it, the locals, particularly the local Kiwi staff, were just wonderful people, super passionate people, and super talented and skilled. And I mean, that's really what allowed all this to happen is their combination of their skills, their experience, and their passion, that they were never just coming in to just do a job. They all had Middle Earth in their blood. And it made it wonderful to come to work in the morning, to have that kind of support and atmosphere around us, that everybody was trying to do their very best work, not just because they wanted to do their very best work, because they wanted to make this world come to life. It's important to them.
Absolutely.
Yeah. That was like 8 different answers to one question.
That was brilliant. I loved it. I would give anything to see the Gantt charts for us. They must have taken up entire walls.
It sounds like herding cats to me, but
well, and there's definitely that. I mean, one of the things that it is a bunch of artists, right? Yeah, and so there's that inherently, and there is an issue that the story is always almost by necessity shifting at least somewhat. And it's shifting because as you have the broad arc, Patrick and JD know the story they're trying to tell, but the beats along the way not only get affected by as they learn things about their story, but also just logistically. Oh, geez, we can't go to that location, or geez, we can't build that set. There's just not enough time, or there's not enough money, or it becomes too visual effects, and we don't want that many visual effects. We want things that are practical. Yeah. So they're having to constantly adjust their storytelling, which means that we're always moving. There's never any, this is the straight path from here to there. We're always having to dodge and weave and come up with stuff as we go. And it takes a bunch of people to do that.
It sure does.
That's amazing. Okay, so this kind of bounces off what we asked you there, because you're talking about the entirety of the process. So focusing a little bit, what's your starting point for each of the regions in Rings of Power? Is your approach different to each different region?
Yes, in the sense that what was important was what's the core of each culture? What are the things that Tolkien has said about each culture? What are the things that our story needs to make clear about each culture? And that on one level is a bunch of words, and those are conversations to have. And then having those conversations at the same time that doing a bunch of research, both into what has existed in the Third Age, and also just looking at our world to see what the cognates are. If you make a fantasy world that doesn't have any touchstones that we all recognize, it just becomes, you can't get your arms around it. It can be beautiful. It can be evocative. He was trying to create a world that was specific, and that you could feel like you understood what Frodo and Sam had for lunch every day. It's a very kind of tactile world. Mm-hmm. So one of the things we talked about very early on with the showrunners is making sure that specificity and that almost grittiness was part of our visual storytelling. So that led me to take each world and start to figure out what the visual representations of those worlds might be, which could take multiple paths. For example, elves have tended to be represented with this kind of Art Nouveau sensibility. And to me, that felt almost decadent. Like by the time you get to the Third Age, definitely the dwarves dug too far and too greedily. They went straight into decadence. But even the discussions we had about the elves is what they're trying so hard at this point to hang on to who they are and what they've got left in Middle-earth, that they're almost trying too hard. So that the idea that the visual representation of that is a little bit too formalized. And that's how you got to Art Nouveau. So dialing back from that, really not even thinking about our art styles, what is it what would elves care about? Well, they were born in a forest under stars. And they lived there for who knows how much time. It's never really clear, but it's a long time that's where they lived, was in forest under stars. So if they finally get to a point where they can make architecture, what would they represent their architecture with? Well, forest. So thinking about how you look at a forest and how branches and trees and vines start to form together and make archways, and they've become these kind of pointed arches, which starts to suggest a sense of Gothic architecture, but it's not coming from Gothic. It's not about reaching to God. It's not about pointing to the heavens. It's about because that's how trees grow together. And thinking about then how that might form itself then into all forms of architecture. So we did look at Art Nouveau, but we also looked at very ancient Celtic forms. Like there's an early culture called Latine, and we looked at their graphics, which were much more primitive, but still had a sense of that organic and curvilinear design to it. I looked at the macro photography of Losfeld. He did at least late 19th century macro photography, black and white of plants. And they're just architectural and graphic and striking, but they're still very organic. And so pulling from those elements to start to see. And there were we definitely looked at romantic artists from the 19th century and early 20th century to see how they expressed that kind of sense of fantasy. And so we looked at various illustrators and painters from the 19th century, and some of them were more heavily in the romantic school, but we also looked at impressionists to get that kind of more softness characteristic. what elven world would be. So that all sprung from the idea that elves came from the woods and from nature and from the stars. That also led us to like, why would there be towers in elvish architecture? What's the point of towers? There's not that many elves. You don't need a bunch of apartment complexes.
They can spread out. They don't need to build vertically, right?
Yeah. So why do they build towers? Well, the discussion that we got to is that because they want to get up where they can see the nature. They're closer to the stars. Mm-hmm. And now they can meditate and be part of nature and in their environment. So there's a reason for towers, not just because it's cool, but that is a functional of what they want to do to express their involvement and interaction with and exploration of the nature around them. So that contrasts, of course, with the dwarves, which Tolkien says are of stone and flame or of stone and fire. And so that gives us a whole different kind of starting point for how to get to the dwarves. And without getting into the details for each of the different cultures, but basically that's the kind of methodology that I'd looked at to start to find is what really is the thing that both Tolkien has said and what we need to say for our storytelling that can give us the basis, and then finding what in the real world, what are the elements of our real history that we can start to pull from to meld that together, and always keeping in the back of our head, it has to be able to grow into what we've seen in the movies.
Yeah.
So that we're not literally pulling any design from the movies for many reasons, not the least of which are legal, that we can't actually do that.
Right.
But the idea that is 3,000 years in the future, and everything, even elves who are immortal and don't forget anything, that's still going to morph a little bit over 3,000 years.
Exactly.
You know? So, and they have different functionalities. You know, Lothlorien has a different functionality than Linden, right? So it's going to be a different place. Mm-hmm. So there were elements of Lothlorien that I picked from to dial back, make them less formal, less regularized, and figure out a way to make them more natural and more organic and kind of more grand and gracious in the sense of the Linden architecture. And there are little bits, like we looked at Rivendell, and if you look carefully at Eregion, because we know that Elrond is going to take the people who survived the attack of Eregion and go and form Rivendell. So I wanted to pick up those elements of Rivendell that he would have learned having been in Eregion with Celebrimbor. So you can there are tile elements, there are window elements, there are textural elements, some roof lines. I mean, you can see all of that there. It's not a direct copy, but you can see where Elrond was trying to honor the memory of Celebrimbor when he built Rivendell.
Oh, wow.
Wow.
So there'd be like a logical flow then from the Second Age into the Third Age.
Correct. Yeah, absolutely.
Fascinating.
And we did a similar thing, I mean, in terms of the whole idea of Númenor. That's a culture that in our storytelling, we're kind of near the end of the Second Age in our storytelling, right? So Númenor has been around for almost 3,000 years or more than 3,000 years at this point. And it's gone through a whole history where it started off being very Elvish influenced. And then definitely over time, more and more reasons to not be Elvish and to actually then become anti-Elvish. But the sense that all of that is layered up over history. It's like Rome. It's been around for thousands of years, and you see all of that history in the architecture. So we developed a whole kind of 4 major history elements of design style for Númenor, starting with very elven looking, and then how it became a little bit more human. And then there was a moment like 400, 500 years ago where it's like, no more elves. Everything wants to be non-elven. We want to stop being pointy and organic, and everything starts being about geometric and bold and squares and domes, you know, so that it takes on this different characteristic, which again is leading to what we know is in Minas Tirith from the movies, right? The idea that we could look at Minas Tirith as that's the ghost of Númenor. Yeah. So in terms of thinking about the whiteness and the spareness of Minas Tirith, and then turning that into bolder and bigger and brighter and more colorful and more greenery and more water everywhere to make that a much more vibrant space. But you can see the bones of Minas Tirith in the design of Númenor.
Yeah. Oh, you certainly can. Yeah.
Yeah. I have to say, Númenor is my absolute favorite of the regions. I just think it's stunning. Really beautifully realized.
Well, thank you.
So, Ramsey, how do you view the partnership between production designer and cinematographer? So we're sort of going from, we looked at production designer and concept art with John Howe. What's it like to go to that other direction between you and the cinematographer? And then how did that work on Rings of Power?
Well, it's because it's a TV show. It's different in that level than it is necessarily in like a feature film. In a feature film, the cinematographer is on very early, usually, and has a very strong input into characteristic look of a project because of the lighting and the way the camera is going to move through the spaces is their purview.
Right.
Working with the director. When you're doing a series, you've got a different kind of hierarchy involved in it. You have a director, but really the director is serving toward the vision of the showrunners. And you have multiple cinematographers who are going to come on over the run of the project. So you have the cinematographer who you start off with, and then you have some other cinematographers who are going to come in with other directors who are going to have their opinions, but it all is operating under the rubric of what the showrunners are guiding us to do. So it's a slightly different process than you think about it in terms of a feature film.
Sounds more complicated then because you'd be working with different ones.
Yeah, there's more cooks in the kitchen for sure. Some of the things you find out is that, and this is the first series that I've done pilots, but I've never actually worked on a series before this one, other than way back when in sitcoms, which are a whole nother beast entirely. The idea of having to go to a cinematographer after you've already designed a set and say, sorry, dude, this is what you have to deal with is a little like not in my nature because I want to have everybody's making this world together. And so we should all be talking about how to make this world. And everybody has opinion, everybody has good ideas, and we need to find all those ideas and bring them together. Having said all of that, we definitely, for the first 2 episodes, we wanted to start off with, and we were asked to produce J.A. wanted us to produce a piece of concept art as a piece of key art for practically every scene in the first 2 episodes, which is a huge amount of art to produce.
Yeah.
I actually started late in the project for various unsundry reasons, so I had a very short period of time to do the work, and then this request came on and we had even less time to get the work done. But what was very useful about a piece of key art, when there's a differentiation between key art and concept art, a piece of concept art will tell what the world looks like, and it'll give a sense of mood, it'll give a sense of place. It doesn't necessarily talk about a specific moment, which is all about characters in the space doing a specific thing with specific lighting, wearing specific costume.
Okay.
So that becomes it's a very descriptive piece of art, and that doing 150 pieces of those art in a short period of time.
Wow.
What that did is that you got to talk about the lighting in all of those cases. So we'd sit in a meeting with J.A. and Belena and Oscar and talk about how the lighting in each of these scenes would work, what J.A. was thinking about, how the camera was going to move through, what he thought was important, and how Oscar was going to approach all of that. So we kind of established a vocabulary for what those looks would be in those initial 2 pilots. But you'll notice, I mean, you can tell that the 2 pilots are shot and they have a different characteristic than the next 3 episodes, than the next 2 episodes. You know, that there's different lighting qualities, there's different ways the camera is used, and there's different ways of the expression and the integration of visual effects. Each of those different blocks of people did it in a slightly different way. And so as each person came on, then I would talk with each of them about what they were seeing with their directors. Wayne and Aaron, would have a specific idea about Númenor and how we're going to deal with the lighting of Númenor. And one of the things that's really definitely interesting in this whole process with all of the cinematographers is that you don't get electric lights in Middle Earth. Everything has to be lit with flame, moonlight, or the sun. And whether or not you're really using the sun or the moon or flame, and a lot of times you are. And how does that actually affect the environments? And how does the cinematographer use that to his advantage? And there are things that we were trying to be very specific about in terms of the cultures, like dwarves almost always have open flame because, again, that thing about dwarves being of stone and flame. So that we wanted in their world to have all this open flame, which you don't see in a lot of the other environments. But open flame doesn't necessarily direct light in a way that's useful for a cinematographer. So, like, we started off with big open braziers lighting Durin's house in there, but it really didn't put the light where we needed to put the light. No. So Oscar said, can you give me some type of a light fixture that allows me to cover the flame, the oil lamps in there that can give us that sense that I can direct the light? And there is a phrase in the Song of Durin about crystal lights. So we went to this idea of using kind of an onyx kind of material with big, heavy iron fittings, and that became those big lights that are in the space. So those lights actually came from a place of the cinematographer needs light that does this specific thing in this specific place. What can you give him?
Right.
So that wasn't about this is a cool thing to have, although it did turn into a good thing for Elrond to duck his head against, so that it did have a practical function. But that's one of those things where you're talking specifically with the cinematographers about how they're going to get light into your spaces.
My goodness.
Wow.
That's amazing.
That really is. I'm thinking about all the lighting techniques as a photographer in my day job. I do architectural photography, and so I'm thinking, you're right. You can't put a scrim up. You can't put a gobo up. What are you going to do?
Yeah,
open flame is open flame, and that's a very interesting approach to solve a very practical problem, but in an in-universe way.
Yeah,
very cool. Yeah. Very cool.
So, what were the biggest challenges in working with an established universe design-wise? And what were the biggest advantages of that?
The biggest challenge was perhaps the fear factor of going into this knowing that no matter what you did, you're going to piss somebody off.
Yep.
Preach it.
And there was a point at which that for a short period of time almost became debilitating. And I got to the point where I realized, this is really important to me. This world has been really important to me since I was 10. It really kind of drove a lot of my interests in who I am and the friends I hung out with. It's important to me. Almost everybody I'm working with, it's important to them on almost exactly that same level. There's nobody here that's a hack. Nobody's here just to make a buck. We all care deeply about this. And I believed, and I still believe to this day, that because we all cared, our choices were governed by that care. That nobody was going to do something that we all kept looking back to the words. It was just always to figure out what did Tolkien say. And sometimes we'd have to make choices to tell our story that because of one reason or another didn't fit necessarily with Tolkien's words, but it was still the basis of all of that. I was rereading the Silmarillion almost every night for 2 years, just to make sure that tonality, and I had that history in my head all the time, so that there was that feeling of we could trust ourselves to make this world because we all cared. So that was probably the biggest challenge of that, was acknowledging the fact that we could do it, and we could do it with some confidence because we all had the right intent at heart. And the equally difficult part of that is that because this IP has been around since forever, there has been a million versions of it out in the world. And while right now the one version that we tend to recognize is the Peter Jackson movies, that's not the only version of it. I mean, when I was a kid, it was the Brothers Hildebrand. That's what Middle-earth looked like, which is different than the Alan Lee, John Howe, Peter Jackson version of Middle-earth.
Yeah.
But there's definitely a sense of that epicness and the wildness that's in the Hildebrand that still shows up in the Peter Jackson. So it was trying to sift through all of that visual information that lives in the world and that the fan base is expecting, and finding the pieces that we could connect to our story that was the basic core DNA of Tolkien that we could make to Middle-earth. And in some ways, that was also some of the best parts of it, because you had all of that to work with, and you did know that there was an end goal. While, we weren't ever wanting to be slavish to what the Peter Jackson movies said, you can't ignore the fact that, one, they're brilliant movies, and they created a really good and compelling world, and we're part of that continuity. So how do we get to that? What are our beats that we have that recognize that? And so that gives us some signposting. We've got signposts in Tolkien and his actual drawings, which are great to just go back and look at the cleanliness of his drawings and the specific and very clean graphic world that he creates with his drawings, and thinking about how our worlds want to look for that kind of core-based graphic simplicity where we can. Yeah. At a starting point, and then all the way up to the Peter Jackson version of it, which is the decadent, collapsed version of it. And where do we fit in the middle of that?
Wow.
I think what was loveliest to hear there, I mean, all of it's fantastic to listen to, but listening to you talk about that sense of collective emotional connection to Tolkien is lovely to hear from, you're sitting here in a room full of nerds, Tolkien nerds, but to hear that you are all Tolkien nerds too is just joyous to hear.
Yeah.
I mean, and different people certainly bring different amounts to it. Some people only come from the movies, that they don't necessarily have the depth of reading the books. But then there was one guy in our office who had the whole 10-volume history on his desk. And, he was just reading through it every day.
I love it.
Like it. So we definitely had that range of knowledge, but we had a complete commitment of passion almost across the board.
Yeah.
Well, that certainly shows, at least from what we could tell. James and I were out there in May for that preview, and when we met you and John Howe and the showrunners, and even then we knew we were
the passion was clear.
The passion, the Tolkien knowledge, the love for the works really showed then, and it's showed ever since. So Ramsey, thank you for taking your time this morning to join us at the Rings of Power wrap-up. I want you to know how much we all really appreciate it. You're welcome back anytime, so let us know. We'll bring you back on next season anytime you want.
I'd be happy to, very much. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Thank you. It's been lovely to talk to you.
Well, folks, that concludes another episode of the Rings of Power wrap-up. But please be sure to join us again in 2 weeks when we'll be joined by Farazan himself, Tristan Gravel.
Thanks to the team that helps us get this show out to you. Editor Jordan Rannells, Barliman Becca Davis, social media manager Casey Hilsey, and website guru Phil Dean.
And speaking of the website, give us a visit there at ringswrapup.com. We've got show notes, our online storefront, and even some outtakes.
You'll also want to take a look at our library page. This show may be about the Amazon adaptation, but the three of us are first and foremost fans of the books. So we provided links for you to get all the lore. We do get a few pennies from the purchases you make there, so thank you in advance.
Indeed. One last thing, as always, don't forget to send your thoughts, comments, and most of all, what your favorite Second Age location is to Barliman at theprancingponypodcast.com. And if you want a chance to have your actual voice heard, you can send us audio of you asking your question by visiting podinbox.com/prancingponypod and record your question for us there.
But be sure to send the question to Barliman too. Now, we've been able to rely on Barliman lately, but we do get a lot of mail, so we'll get to you when we can. Your question or comment may be featured on a future episode.
As always, though, this has been far too short a time to spend among such excellent and admirable listeners. Until next time.
Farewell, friends.